Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here today. So, any fool can tell a crisis when it arrives. The real service to society is to detect it in embryo. When I first read these words as a child in Isaac Asimov's famed Foundation series, I was fascinated by this vision of psychohistory, that we could use computers to make sense of all the data that surrounds us, to map the present, and even perhaps forecast the future. That machines could make sense of this deluge of data that surrounds us and make sense of the underlying patterns. And make sense of the underlying patterns. To see the earliest glimmers of everything from epidemics to genocide. To understand what makes us tick as humans, the narratives that shape our understanding of society, the emotions that capture how we're reacting to everything occurring around us, our global dreams and fears. My own work over the past 22 years has focused on how do we take this data and really essentially reimagine our world through data, to find the subtle among the obvious at scales that no human could imagine. In short, to tell the untold stories from across the world. Now, data gives us an incredible new lens through which to understand the world. Now, oftentimes when we talk about mapping global society, we talk about social media. Billions of tweets coalesce on a map to show us a society in motion. There are languages tracing national boundaries. There are geographic clusters giving us transportation corridors. The connections among them tracing the communicative and cultural center points that capture who and what we talk about in our globalized world. But amongst all this light, it's important to never forget the darkness, all the sides that we don't hear. That when a Scud missile is fired from one country into another, Twitter may light up like a Christmas tree from one side, but we're missing an entire half of that conversation. And this is really important, that we talk about social media as this incredible lens onto society, that it lights up like a Christmas tree, but to forget that the rest of that room has a whole lot there that we're not necessarily seeing. Now, it's not just social media that's limited. Mainstream media is also incredibly biased. Any given source reflects a myriad of local biases in its context. So it's clear, if we want to understand society, we're going to have to look beyond a single source, not one fire hose or one set of data. We're going to have to bring a lot of data together to listen to the world. And why is this important, you might say? Why is it worth trying to understand the world around us? Well, imagine, rewind the clock to the index case of the Ebola outbreak. Imagine if we could take all of those myriad signals that were emerging at the time, and there were a lot of signals, and make sense of that. We have so much data today, but we tend to be really bad at analyzing and making sense of that data. Imagine if we could have done that. Imagine if at the time period we have been able to see those signals and put them into context. Could we have saved 11,000 lives? Now, in the wise words of Machiavelli, whoever wishes to foresee the future must consult the past, for human events ever resemble those of preceding times. What's interesting about this, if we think about this, if we want to try to make psychohistory real, if we want to try to bring Asimov's vision to life, really, if we could take all this data we already have about society and make sense of that, could we actually do something like that? Well, in 2011, I published a paper called Culturomics 2.0 that showed that by data mining 100 million news articles and focusing not on the physical things there, but on the latent dimensions, things like the emotional undercurrents of that content, what locations were being talked about and in what context and how, it turns out that we were able to forecast the Arab Spring and give ourselves bin Laden's location to within 200 kilometers of where he was actually found. In short, that there's this incredible richness in the data that surrounds us that only really becomes visible when we start teasing apart those undercurrents at massive scale. Now, in that particular piece, I had to limit myself to whole country collapse because there simply were no data sets that focused beneath that. If I said, give me a spreadsheet of all the labor protests that have occurred in the last 24 hours anywhere on Earth, that type of data set simply didn't exist. But if I want to build a model that can forecast, for example, where we're going to see civil unrest around the world, I need to have training data. I need to actually know where these things occur. And imagine if we could do that. Imagine if we could take, for example, a labor protest is breaking out right now somewhere on Earth and put a dot in a map, and literally, as it happens, to allow machines to essentially watch the world go by. Well, that was the vision that led to the GDELT project that I founded in 2013, which is an open data project designed to say, well, what if we could take all of this open data that surrounds us and apply massive computing power and algorithms and mindsets to try to understand the world. Now, of course, like any good data-driven project, it relies on a lot of data. So global news media, print, broadcast, web, in over 100 languages. 65 of those are live machine translated, and I'll come back to that in a second. Imagery. So, a textual news article might say there's massive protests breaking out. But your definition of massive might be 100 people. My definition might be 100 million people. And so imagery, we have so much imagery today, that ability to ground truth what's occurring. And I'll come back to this in a second. I'll show you a sequence of what's possible by looking at looking through imagery, and especially combining those two pieces, combining the textual narratives that have historically captured the world for us with these new visual narratives. Being able to look at things like human rights or other types of very high-resolution data that capture specific dimensions. Being able to look more creatively at things like television. Books allow us to look back across centuries. And academic literature. This is something oftentimes when we talk about the world, we get too caught up in what's happening right now, and we stop. We don't ask the more important question, which is why? Why is this occurring? Why are these two groups fighting right now? Now, so I've just showed you, a lot of data pouring into this system. But contrary to how some people in Washington, D.C., where I'm from, a lot of people in Washington seem to have this idea that everything on Earth is in English. There's no reason, there's no need to process beyond English. And indeed, most of the tools that we have to do a lot of the data mining projects are designed only for English. But yet, if we want to listen to the world, we obviously have to look far broader than that. Now, machine translation is far from perfect right now, but machine translation today is actually good enough to give us a pretty good general gist for a good number of languages today. Obviously, there's going to be errors in that, but it's good enough to monitor this material and give us, to tell, for example, that this Arabic language article is talking about a protest. 100 people were involved, 20 people were arrested. The ability for machines to allow us to peer across that. So in GDEL's case, right now, we monitor 100 languages, 35 we get hand translations sporadically from partners across the world, but for 65 of those languages, we live machine translate. Absolutely everything that arrives in those languages are machine translated, and we're at a point today where we can actually do that, where that's actually tractable. Now, of course, you might say, well, why bother? Is there really enough material to warrant that? Well, this is an image of the Yemen conflict seen through English versus Arabic. If you're looking at what's happening in Yemen only through the eyes of Western English language press, you're missing a whole lot of that story. So you can imagine this fire hose of data pouring in, all this material being machine translated. Well, what can we do with that? How do we go from this fire hose of translated material to something that would allow us to do psychohistory? Well, we do two things for the textual data, and I'll come to images in a second. But for textual data, we take, for example, we do two things. One is physical events. So we want to take this article that talks about a labor protest, and we want to convert that from a textual article to a spreadsheet entry that says, here's a protest that occurred right here, the location, number of people involved, why they were protesting, and then be able to connect that and to say, well, the police arrested 20 people, and then in turn, these people, this occurred and this occurred. So be able to essentially take the fire hose of textual data and represent that in quantitative form that machines can actually process. But oftentimes, we know what's physically occurring. What we care about is the emotions. How is the world reacting to North Korea right now? How are they internalizing that? So the narratives and emotions that undergird society are actually far more powerful oftentimes to understand society. So you can imagine we have this fire hose of data coming in. We're machine translating the stuff that isn't in English. We're pulling out physical events. We're pulling out narratives and emotions. What can we do with that? How is that useful? Well, once you have this stuff in codified form, machines can essentially watch the world go by for you. They can tell you that there's the first glimmers of instability in Burundi right now. They can tell you that 5 seconds ago, 2 tanks just rolled across a bridge in Turkey. They can watch the world. They don't get tired, and they can watch the entire world ceaselessly and give you those early glimmers to tell you something that a human would never have caught. And that becomes very powerful. This ability to take something, for example, the refugee crisis that's occurring right now, to be able to track both where are those refugees going, how are they moving, but also the reaction to that. So to trace, for example, refugees here are being welcomed with open arms. Refugees over here are being pushed away. But more importantly, to track how that's changing, to track areas that have previously welcomed refugees and are now pushing them away. That becomes very powerful if we try to think about how the world's reacting to itself. How, essentially, the world itself, human society as a whole, is almost this living, breathing creature. And be able to capture that. We can look backwards at time to look at the root undercurrents of unrest, to look at how different the histories of countries and what have impacted what's occurred there, and tease apart these subtle patterns. And then look to the future and take those subtle patterns and use them to actually forecast what is to come. And what's so interesting about this, this particular analysis, there was a big piece it did a couple years ago on the cycles of world history. And using Google's BigQuery platform, one single line of SQL code was able to take a several hundred million event data set, fold it on top of itself, and essentially brute force cross-correlate its way through the data set to uncover the cycles that were there. Now, what was so interesting about this is something that I had thought about for a long time and never been able to execute because I simply didn't have the time to sit down and write the code that could efficiently go through all that material. With the advent of tools like BigQuery, someone like me could come along and really, with one line of code in 2.5 minutes, answer that question. We've really reached the point where the data and the tools really aren't the limiting factors anymore, where you can say, I wonder, and actually have an answer. And that's an incredible place that we're in today. Now, of course, in today's world, imagery is so powerful. Today, I don't post a tweet and say, it's a beautiful day outside. I post a picture of a cloudless sky. I don't post, I don't text and say, wow, there's protesters marching down the street. I live stream it. Imagery allows us to capture the world and convey emotions in ways that no mere words simply can. This ability to see the world visually, to, for example, take half a millennium of digitized books, take hundreds of millions of pages of digitized books, and array them in a collage that shows us year by year the global dreams and fears of human society. To be able to look back at the elder world's fascination with the danse macabre, or the power of death over life, to the 19th century's fascination with scientific progress and innovation. But what unites all of this is that we've never historically had tools that could actually make sense of all this imagery, or let alone the live deluge of imagery that surrounds us each day. We've been able to deal with text. You think about so much of the computing era has been focused on text. Imagery we simply discard. In fact, when it came to books, what you saw there was a project to say, almost all the work we've done to digitize books has been to make the text searchable and throw away the imagery. What if we inverted that? And what's interesting, though, is we really haven't had the tools. Yeah, we've had tools that could tell you this image seems to have a blob that kind of looks maybe like water, and it has a lot of red in the picture. And sure, there were tools that could do a little bit more than that. But we've really reached the point in the last few years where the tools are robust, and most importantly, they work globally. That I can hand an image from anywhere in the world, that it can actually make sense of that. And this becomes powerful because once machines can start looking at that deluge of imagery, we can start asking really fascinating questions. We can take, for example, 300 million news images captured from news outlets all across the world over the last year and a half, covering every country, and we can ask questions. We can say, when we see the world through the lens of news media, what do we see? Do we see a sanitized version of the world devoid of pain and suffering? Or do we see a world that shows us what life is really like, that captures the world around us? We can ask, to what degree does that news imagery humanize the world? Do we see cold imagery that simply shows us landscapes and objects? Or do we really see the human impact of the global events that surround us? If you think about it, an image of a child running from a napalm attack became the iconic image that defined the Vietnam War to a generation in the United States. A 10-year-old's lifeless body on a beach really brought home the tragedy and heartbreak of the refugee crisis to the world. Images are so powerful for the way in which they capture things in a way that simply we've never really had before. And the ability, for example, to map out emotions. So, for example, to use deep learning tools. So this is, by the way, all comes from Google's Cloud Vision platform, which is their API that can do incredible things with images. Well, we can take those 300 million images, and with a single line of SQL, we can say, by country, take all the news imagery coming out of each country, and measure the average emotion on the human faces of all those imagery over the past year and a half. And we can measure joy, anger, surprise, sorrow. This becomes really fascinating. Now, again, you could argue, again, how good the algorithm is across the world. You could argue questions about, well, maybe the news media in each part of the world is capturing certain emotions more than others. And these are fascinating questions. So, for example, the slide I just showed, the percentage of human faces, you'll notice that there were strong geographic patterns there. Some parts of the world really do represent the world through human faces. Other parts of the world prefer landscapes and objects. So this really, once we have these, we've never really been able to look at these things at scale. Historically, you had a few humans, a team of undergraduates, for example, go through kind of a small sample of maybe a few thousand images. But today we can actually look holistically. We can actually say, well, here's the entirety of the news imagery that has been published in a particular news outlet over the past year. We can actually ask these questions. We can see how they're visually portraying the world. We can do really fascinating things. For a long time, people have tried to map global happiness and sadness. And all these different techniques have been, suggested for how to actually measure how happy or sad are we as a human society. Well, this was the question that I asked. I said, well, what about through the eyes of the news media? What if we just took, all the news media that we could monitor over an entire year and take every single reference, say, to Paris across all that coverage, or Lisbon, let's take Lisbon, all the coverage of that across the world every time it's mentioned, and then put a dot there on the map, colored from bright red, which is very negative, to bright green, the very positive, that captures how has the world portrayed that city over the past year. One line of SQL in BigQuery, 2.2 billion mentions of location, 300 million photographs, 750 billion emotional assessments from this collection over 1 year. And in one line of SQL, in about 60 seconds, you can make a map like this. That represents an incredible, again, the material's already been pre-processed, so what we're doing is taking that pre-processed data and making sense of that. But that's an incredible world. The fact that someone like me could come along and say, I wonder, what would it look like to visualize the world, global happiness through news media, and to be able to make a map like this, we've really reached that point, that, kind of that operating at the speed of data point, to be able to answer questions like, how is the world portrayed for us? When we turn to the media around us, what is the view that we're seeing of global society? To be able to ask, countless people have tried to divide the world into civilizations. Well, what if we could take those 2.2 billion mentions of location in a given year and say, well, every time someone mentions France, what are the other countries that they mention? Every time they mention Portugal, what are the other countries that they tend to mention in context to it? And by looking across 2.5 billion references, we can make a map that actually shows how is the world connected, at least to the eyes of the news media. And of course, then you could narrow that by country and say, well, how does the media of a particular country portray the world? These are really fascinating things that for the first time we can actually ask those questions of what are we seeing when we turn to the world? We can take the trillions and trillions of connections that's captured in all that data and represent that as a single massive network diagram that shows us the world and really looks like beautiful art, but at the same time can be zoomed in and actually offer us actionable insights about the influencers that are shaping the global conversation in a particular sector. Now, of course, as a big data project, it involves a lot of data. And so GDAL operates entirely on the Google Cloud platform. Now, for its computing power, it relies primarily on Google's compute engine. So again, large number of VMs. And as someone who spent, 18 years now in the high-performance computing, the supercomputing world, it's been really fascinating to kind of watch as kind of the, as things have moved, back and forth. And the cloud has been really fascinating to me because, historically, I'm used to operating on big machines that were built for traditional hard sciences. They need lots of CPU, incredible numbers of CPU. But if you built a machine that had only CPU and no memory or disk, some of them would be perfectly happy. Versus the type of work I do is really data-oriented. I'm doing certainly a lot of compute, but for me, it's really about moving massive amounts of data around. And that's what's really fascinating me about the cloud that exists today. You look, in particular, Google's cloud, you're thinking about that cloud really has come out of what they themselves have needed to operate such a large search engine. So its ability to leverage that infrastructure. So compute engine, storage, but it's these two things on the right, BigQuery and machine learning, that are really exciting to me. So when I did my dissertation, the deep learning tools just weren't quite there yet. yet. And so, so for my own work, I'm not a deep learning specialist. So for me to be able to leverage these APIs that they're rolling out, as they, for example, roll out a video API, all of a sudden now I can process all this video I'm monitoring. So it's kind of this almost like Lego bricks that I can take this data, fill it through these various pieces, get that back, then use BigQuery to make sense of all that data. And I'd like to thank Alphabet, Jigsaw, and Google for their support of this project, and especially for making this available for allowing me to make this available as an open data set. And I'd like to end with this image, that really this captures in a single image the real focus of my work, which is really about how do we take the world's data and really reimagine what makes us tick as a society. Thank you so much.